I was just saying that it's also wonderful to be at another UW system campus. Sometimes in Madison, as much as they try to get the blinders on, and I really do enjoy seeing our sister schools throughout the state. Particularly, this is about the furthest corner I can get to, and I do enjoy speaking in a lot of different venues and engaging with people throughout Wisconsin who are doing amazing work. So I will start off by answering the question that many people have when they read the bio and see all the letters after my name. Yes, I have a lot of student loan debt, so we'll just get that out of the way there. All right. So I'm going to be spending some time today talking about early brain development and then trying to make a connection to the world of literacy. So we'll get started in the medical world. We always have disclosure slides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although I always point out that I don't know if the FDA ever formally approved mouthing as a use of board books. This is my son, who is 16 now and started his junior year of high school yesterday, and is incredibly embarrassed that I showed this photo. So of course I'm going to keep showing it as much as I can. So when I tell people that one of the things I do in primary care pediatrics, so I still am a practicing pediatrician, and I did primary care for many years in a number of settings, including quite a few in a community health center, working with underprivileged populations. When I tell people that one of the things I do is encourage families to share books together with their young children and read to them every day, the answer or the response I normally get is something like this. Oh, that's so nice. So great that you do that. I say, well, it is a great thing. It's a lovely thing. It's actually one of the most pleasant parts of my job. I want to move us beyond this idea that this is nice, isn't that great, isn't that lovely, to recognize that when we give that sort of advice, it's actually absolutely critical. And not critical just for that child or that family or that neighborhood, but really for all of us as a society. So on our brief voyage together today, we're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk about the world of the early brain, and I promise this will not be a highly technical talk. My goal here, and some of the things I share with you may be old news to you. Okay? What I'm trying to do, though, is give you enough of the science and the background of what we know to help you figure out how do you apply this to the work you do, the parenting you do, the projects you work on, the policies you advocate for, and so on and so forth. Then we'll talk a bit about the reality of reading in our society, and then I want to touch briefly on a program that I'm involved with called Reach Out and Read. But one of my degrees is actually in children's librarianship. Really long story how that happened, okay, so we'll get there. So I thought everyone, including adults, deserves story time. So we're going to start by reading a story. We're going to read from The Dot by Peter H. Reynolds, and you'll see the images up here as I read out loud. Art class was over, but Vashti sat glued to her chair. Her paper was empty. Vashti's teacher leaned over the blank paper. "Ah, a polar bear in a snowstorm," she said. "Very funny," said Vashti. "I just can't draw." Her teacher smiled. "Just make a mark and see where it takes you." Vashti grabbed the marker and gave the paper a good, strong jab. "There." Her teacher picked up the paper and studied it carefully. She pushed the paper toward Vashti and quietly said, "Now sign it." Vashti thought for a moment. "Well, maybe I can't draw, but I can sign my name." The next week, when Vashti walked into art class, she was surprised to see what was hanging above her teacher's desk. It was the little dot she had drawn, her dot, all framed in swirly gold. I can make a better dot than that." She opened her never-before-used set of watercolors and set to work. Vashti painted and painted, a red dot, a purple dot, a yellow dot, a blue dot. The blue mixed with the yellow. She discovered she could make a green dot. Vashti kept experimenting, lots of little dots in many colors. If I can make little dots, I can make big dots too. Vashti splashed her colors with a bigger brush on bigger paper to make bigger dots. Vashti even made a dot by not painting a dot. At the school art show a few weeks later, Vashti's many dots made quite a splash. Vashti noticed a little boy gazing up at her. "You're a really great artist. I wish I could draw," he said. "I bet you can," said Vashti. Oh, me? No, not me. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. Vashti smiled. She handed the boy a blank sheet of paper. Show me. The boy's pencil shook as he drew his line. Vashti stared at the boy's scribble, and then she said, "Please, sign it." So there's a reason I chose that story, and we'll come back to that a little later, but let's start by talking a bit about the world of the early brain. The American Academy of Pediatrics has this agenda for children that they lay out each year. This one's from a few years ago, but you can see the central priorities of the Academy right there in the middle, and one of them is early brain and child development. And I'm proud to have served in the National Leadership Group for this initiative, which has now integrated its work into the Academy's work as a whole. Now, just over a decade ago, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came out with this report called The Science of Early Childhood Development. What they tried to do was say, let's take all the research that's out there, and let's try to pull that together into some big ideas, some big concepts. Because, it's easy to get lost sometimes in the research and say, well, there's a study saying this, or there's a study saying that, and does that mean we should change what we do, or is it going to be disproven next week by something else? Or, it's hard to really nail it down. They said, let's synthesize decades of research and pull it together into 6 big points. And even though this report is 10 years old, honestly, everything that they said still holds true and has actually only been strengthened by the work that's come since. So I want to walk through those things. 1, they talked about child development in a way that we're not used to. They said it's a foundation for community and economic development. Okay, now we're not used to talking that way, right? If a kid walks into a room, you don't say, hello, future potential economic unit, right? No. You help kids because kids are worth helping. So, yes, that's all true, but we should also be thinking about children in terms of their potential to society down the road, right? These are our future citizens, employees, employers, inventors, voters, so on and so forth, right? So we need to think about infrastructure development, not just in terms of physical items, right? When we talk about infrastructure, we're often talking about highways and bridges and tunnels and things like that. The infrastructure of the early brain matters just as much as those things. Because you can build all those things and it doesn't matter if there's no one left in your community to use them because they've gone to seek opportunities elsewhere. Right? So when we talk about early brain infrastructure, we should also be talking about it as part of economic infrastructure. Number 2, brains are built over time. This means, yes, we should be focusing on the early years, in the first 1,000 days, as you'll hear me talk about so much today. But it doesn't mean that if we didn't get it right early on that, oh well, we're done, can't do anything else, right? Learning happens throughout life, not just a child's life, but adults as well. There's always opportunities to change things up, to do things differently, new, and so on and so forth. So brains are built over time, but this does mean that we need to take the gains that are made early, ideally, and we need to support those gains as they move along. Because it's sort of a 3-legged stool for thinking about how children will do in terms of their development and health. There's the biological factors that we look at all the time in healthcare. Okay, and those are important. There's a reason we ask about them and focus on them. But then we recognize that there was another thing that mattered just as much, and that was the socioeconomic environment that children are in. That a zip code, the zip code that a child is born and brought up in, matters more than their genetic code when it comes to their outcomes. Right? So whatever area you work in, if you think about it, things are worse when poverty is in play, when danger's in play, etc. We'll talk a fair deal about that as well. And then they recognized that there was a third part to this, that it wasn't just a broader socioeconomic environment, it was the microenvironment that children and families are in. Who's at home? Who's in their neighborhood? Who's in their early childhood center? And how do those folks interact with one another? Those attachment and relationship patterns matter just as much as the other parts of the stool here. And that brings me to the third point, which is that if we said, what are the things that we can influence, that the levers that can be pulled to decide how those neurons are going to wire to each other in that early brain? Because remember, there's so much neural wiring happening early on. The joke in neurobiology is that the first few months of life and beyond, but still the first few months, are kind of like the fourth trimester of pregnancy, at least in terms of brain development. Human babies are born relatively helpless, right? Can't do a whole lot. Think about animals. Animal babies are often standing within minutes of being born. How long does it take a human to do that? A year, right? That's because there's no more brain development that could be done without the head getting too big. I mean, honestly, the babies would not be able to be born. So this is why the trade-off that evolution basically put us into was that, you can have better brain development afterwards, but you're born with a relatively helpless child. So if we want to make sure those neurons continue to wire with each other really well, there's the genes, right? Genes set up the patterning. How does this neuron connect to that one, right? You need that basic blueprint. But which ones connect to which are driven by experiences. And it's like a campfire, right? You need the wood and you need a spark to get that campfire going. You can't have one without the other. Now, we can't modify genes so much. I'm really not going to get into that today. But we can modify experiences. And we do this all the time. We do it through the advice we give. We do it through programs we set up. We do it through policies that we enact. And all those sorts of things make a difference. And then you might say, okay, but what's the central thing? What's the most important thing that we need to do to try to help make sure that those neurons are wiring and connecting together well? And this is where we talk about serve and return relationships, these back and forth interactions that children have with loving caregivers in their environment. Okay, and it's like tennis. You serve that ball, and your partner volleys it back. And that back and forth that happens. This can be eye contact, this can be verbal, this can be touch, any sort of back and forth interaction that is responsive to a child and their environment will drive forward their development. And I want to point out very clearly that the only thing that drives development forward in young children is a child's engagement in these back and forth interactional relationships with others. Okay? It is not driven by toys alone. It is not driven by DVDs. It is not driven by apps or anything like that, despite what parents are being told through marketing. There's a ton of marketing saying to parents, please put your child in front of this DVD series, it'll help them learn, and often with zero evidence to actually back that up. Please give your child this iPad by the time they're a year old, this app will help them. Please implant this phone in utero, otherwise your child will be behind. No, we haven't gotten that far yet. So we need, whatever we do should be trying to support these back and forth interactions in whatever form they may take, and making sure that parents are well equipped for this. Because we are social beings, and it is these back and forth interactions that work with that young child and help connect those neurons for those social and emotional competencies that are so important. I will also point out that play is an important piece of this. I woke up early this morning in order to sit and work on, I write a newspaper column at the Capital Times once a month in Madison. And the column I'm writing is about the recent American Academy of Pediatrics statement on the importance of play. And it really talks deeply, this statement, and talks about the neurobiology, but also then talks about the psychology and so on, about how much play matters, not just in infants and toddlers, but in older kids as well. So to highlight this point, I'm going to play a video for you. I used to work for Ed Tronick when I was an undergraduate. He created this face-to-face paradigm that he'll explain briefly in the video. You'll see what happens when these back and forth interactions go well, what happens when they don't go so well, and then the recovery that happens when the mother comes back. I'll let him explain.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the activity and the social interaction that they get from the world around. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And it's still faces around what the mother did, but she sits down and she's playing with the baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby is sort of pointing in different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we guess to not respond to baby. Baby very quickly picks up on it, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get on back. She smiles at the mother. She points first. She uses the money for she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Oh, come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes when they don't get normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. Good is that normal stuff that goes on. We all do that. Bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome. After all, when we stop this in the face, the mother and the baby sort of play. The other one is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly decision.
So I used to code these tapes as an undergraduate, and the hard part wasn't seeing interactions like that. Okay, that was what we expected, right? You know, baby got upset, mom, why aren't you being responsive, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, she came back, big smiles, you know, all was good. The hard part was when you'd see the mother go into the still face, and the baby just didn't do anything. Just didn't seem to care. Why? They weren't used to this. They weren't used to this back and forth interaction. They weren't used to this engagement. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I don't believe for a moment that any parents in our studies don't love their kids, didn't care about their kids. You know, I think that's true for society in general. I think parents love their kids, they want what's best for them, and so on. The thing is, we think of this back and forth interaction as being automatic, natural, instinctual, right? The problem is, one, there could be things getting in the way of that, right? Various conditions, including things like depression or substance abuse and things like that. But number two, more importantly, is sometimes parents, you know, we think, oh, of course they should know how to play with their kid. Well, it's actually not automatic behavior. It's actually learned behavior. And we learned it by watching other people, right? So no one taught us how to play peekaboo explicitly, but they did in a sense because we watched someone else do it and we patterned what we're doing off of that. So if you live in a community where people don't usually talk to their young infants, engage, play, etc., how would you know how to do that, and how do you know that you're doing it right? So this gets to an important point here, that we do a good job in our society of spanning information gaps, right? Oh, if parents knew that they were supposed to talk, read, sing, play with their young child, if they just knew that, they'd do it, right? Okay, fine. So we put up billboards and ads on the bus and all sorts of brochures and things like that, right? We span this information gap really well. And most parents have heard this over and over and over in general society at this point. We've done that well. The second gap, however, that we're not spanning so well is the skills gap. Right? So think about this. You go home with your 6-month-old and you sit down and you say, okay, they told me I'm supposed to talk with my young child. They said it was important and I want to do what's best. And you start to talk to your child and really soon you feel kind of stupid, right? Your 6-month-old's not going to talk back. Well, are you saying the right things? How do you know it's working? Maybe you didn't do so well in school yourself and you're thinking that you're the wrong person to talk to your child. Maybe you'll teach them the wrong things and they'll struggle in school like you. Maybe they're better off in front of this learning DVD that's made by educators. Yeah, they'll do a better job than I, right? You see how this cycle of self-doubt happens? This cycle of, am I doing it right? I don't know. Maybe I'm not the right person. And so on and so forth. So how do we fix that? Well, we do it through modeling. We do it through coaching. We do it through encouragement, right? You have someone there saying, yes, oh, you did such a great job. And when your baby pointed and you looked at where they pointed, that's wonderful. If you do things like that, and why don't you try this as well, and so on. That modeling, that coaching, that encouragement is what parents need. So they say, oh, okay, great. I'm doing this and I'm doing it right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be this long, engaged, heavy project. This can be built into other settings, as you'll see me talk about later. We need simple circuits to do more complicated things. And sometimes people wonder, why are we putting all this money into kids just playing? Well, if you say it's just playing, that's a profound misunderstanding of what it means to play. Play is not about amusement in children. Play is actually, as has been said by a number of people, including Barry Bradford, play is the work of infancy. Right? The child's job is to play, because this is how they develop their skills and are able to engage, in more and more developmentally complex things. So we need them to play, not just, oh, isn't it nice that they play? They must play. We're going to spend some time on this next point, this idea of toxic stress, and I'm going to define it more carefully in a few moments. But it's associated with persistent effects in the neuroendocrine system, and it can cause persistent issues that last throughout life, not just in learning and behavior, but even in measures of physical health. And I think it's important to recognize this because toxic stress can happen at any income level, although it's much worse in the lower income levels, and with about 40-something% of U.S. children living below 200% of the federal poverty line. This is a lot of kids, a lot of kids. Do remember that demographically, by age, children are the most likely to live in poverty in our U.S., in our country. Okay? And we don't recognize that, right? We don't think of kids as being poor because we don't see them begging out on the street. Yet they are much more likely to be poor than even senior citizens, etc. So I'm going to put up 2 CT scans here. These are both 3-year-old children, and to orient you here, this is looking at the head almost like it's a cut this way looking up into the brain. Okay, that's the perspective you're getting here. The child on the left is a child who, the child on the left, oops, go back there, okay. The child on the left is a child who underwent, who had a fairly typical upbringing, well-supported, etc. The child on the right underwent extreme emotional neglect, not physical. They were fed, bathed, clothed, etc. But there was very little interaction that happened. Okay? This is a child who grew up in an orphanage in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, like a warehouse. Tons of kids, almost no staff. They were scrambling, going from kid to kid to kid, just to meet their physical needs. These brains are different. And you can see that without knowing a whole lot about how to read a head CT. Look at that brain on the left. It's larger than the one on the right. It's filled with neurons. It's dense with neurons compared to that one on the right. It looks shrunken, right? It doesn't look as full. I'm giving you an extreme contrast on purpose because you can look at that and say, oh, yeah, okay, without knowing a whole lot about how to read a head CT. There's more subtle changes that happen that I'll point out at a later point. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about stress. Now, is there anyone here who has absolutely zero stress in their lives? Okay, good. If you raised your hand, I'd have to go and check for a pulse, okay? We often talk about stress as a bad thing, but in biological systems, stress is how we respond to changing environments around us. Okay, so I want to be very clear about that you need small amounts of stress in order to learn, to change, to adapt, all that sort of stuff. If you have no stress, there's no incentive to change. Why would you do things differently? If you have some stress, great. Then learning, doing new things. I mean, this is why we give people exams, right? It's an incentive to do those things. If there's too much stress, you get overwhelmed and you don't learn. So there's sort of a sweet spot that kind of, needs to be met there. Now, we have a couple of stress response systems kind of conceptually, right? We have the stress response system that we come built with, right? This is when right at birth. You're born, you have a stress response system to deal with this strange new world you're in, with, temperature changes and lights and sounds and people prodding you in this weird new sensation that you can't quite understand called hunger, right? And so on. These are all significant stressors for a newborn. Newborns come with this built-in stress system that we all still have and use, which protects us against mortal danger, protects us against, fear, survival, things like that. I like to think of it as being like a big red button in your brain that's marked red alert, and you must hit it, right, when something bad's happening, right? This is like my dog. Every time somebody walks by on the street, and if he hears something, he'll go runs to the front window and start like, he basically, a little red dome light goes off in his brain, and strangely the people keep going. It's like he must have successfully chased them away, is how his dog brain works, right? So that system works really well when you do encounter danger, right? You're walking along in the woods, you trip, you twist your ankle hurts because your body's telling you not to walk on it, it swells because there's blood flow trying to repair the damage. Okay, you'll have to hobble back to your car, this is an inconvenience, and then you see a bear. Uh-oh, right? Okay, ankle doesn't matter anymore, particularly not if it's in the bear's stomach with the rest of you, okay? So what does your body do? You release some stress hormones. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, but then cortisol, which is known as the stress hormone because it does a lot of things to help you cope short-term with stress. It raises your blood sugar so you have ready energy to fight or run or scream or whatever has to happen. It reduces the inflammation in your ankle. It dulls the pain, right? Cortisone shots to, for arthritis, all that. Yeah, same idea, right? And hopefully it gets you safe to safety. Because later, is your ankle really going to be messed up? Oh yeah, sure it is. But you're alive, right? You survived. This system works really well for those occasional danger-filled situations. It is an absolutely horrible way to deal with life on a day-to-day basis, as you'll see. Because the more sophisticated stress response that helps you problem solve, think your way out of things, advocate for yourself, or others, etc., that takes years to develop. Okay, that's something that young kids don't come built with. So we can think conceptually about 3 levels of stress response. There's positive stress, right? Those small stressors that happen that actually you learn from. These are good things, they're positive. This happens every time I give a talk. And that's a good thing. You don't want me forgetting what I say up here or falling asleep or my slides blow up all of a sudden, not being able to give you a talk or whatever, right? So you learn from these sorts of things. Then we have tolerable stress. Tolerable stress are more significant stressors. They're not minor, but they're temporary. And they're buffered by those supportive relationships. There's relationships again, right? So this really matters. Because then we have toxic stress. Toxic stress is when the stress levels go up and they stay up. And they don't really come down. These are things that are long-term, homelessness and things like that. And there's few or no protective relationships to help shield kids from those effects. So in a child's life, what are these things? If there's no supportive relationships present, these are things like child abuse, parental substance abuse, homelessness. When young children experience these sorts of things and they don't have those higher level coping strategies, right? So the 11-year-old who everything was fine and then maybe some of this stuff happens, I'm not going to say it's great for them, but it may be tolerable because they may have some coping skills already by age 11. And they might have some supportive relationships or whatever. The 2-year-old doesn't have that. The 1-year-old doesn't have that. The 3-year-old doesn't have that. And it does things to their biology that we call toxic stress because of how it affects them. Okay, so what actually happens? They have these childhood stressors. This fight or flight, this bear response, that big red button that says red alert, becomes chronic because that's the only stress response system they have, and they keep going for that. They keep hitting that red button over and over and over. They're pumping out these stress hormones all the time. This leads to some changes in the brain that we'll talk about in just a second. But here's what I see. Here's what you see. You can't see inside the brain, but you see behavior. You see behavior of a hyper-responsive stress response. They're not as calm. They can't cope as well. And that in turn feeds to more stress. This hyper-responsive stress response is really important to think about. because this may help us understand some of the behaviors that I think really plague us when we're trying to say what's going on with kids that are quote-unquote problems. Okay, so think about 2 3-year-old kids. They come to childcare, to preschool, and they start preschool. And first day of preschool, one child had a nurturing, loving, household, et cetera, et cetera. That child, is sitting in story time. The teacher starts reading a story, and the kid says something or talks out of turn briefly, right? And the teacher gets a little frown on their face. Now that kid knows that when mom gets that little frown on her face at home, that means, oops, shouldn't have done that, right? They've learned that over their 3 years. And they stop, and everything's fine, no big deal. Compare that to another 2-year-old who didn't have that loving, nurturing, responsive household, right? Maybe their household was filled with violence or fear, and they were constantly bombarded with assaults on their safety. And what they see when they see that little frown is not, oopsie, shouldn't have done that. What they see is, uh-oh, someone's going to get hit, or someone's going to start yelling or throwing things, or someone's going to get hurt. And what do? They go for that big red alert button, because that's the only button they have, and they dive under the table, or they start screaming, or they run down the hall. And everyone says, what is wrong with that kid? That's the wrong question. The question should be, what happened to them? Right? What happened that makes that a response that makes sense to that little 3-year-old? Right? You can't expect a particularly sophisticated response, right? This is all they can do. Now, I'm not arguing that we should let kids run down the hall or, enact out and whatever, but we might get to a better way to help them if we can ask ourselves, what happened here? Why does this make sense for that child to do these things? And hypothesize differently about it. Okay, so what happens in the brain? This is work that's been done right at UW-Madison by my colleague Seth Pollack, who will load kids into MRI scanners and compare different structures in their brain. And he looked at kids and managed to show that those who had been in adverse circumstances early in life versus those who hadn't had some changes that were significant. 3 areas. One is the amygdala. The amygdala is the worry ward of the brain. Okay, this is your fear, your anxiety, your self-preservation. This lights up when that bear appears. Okay, kids who have that early adversity actually have larger amygdala somewhat, because probably it was stimulated over and over early on in life. Now, countering the amygdala are 2 areas. One is the prefrontal cortex. This is your planning, your executive functioning, your delayed gratification, right? This is your stepwise kind of thinking through things. This is on the very rational, methodical part of the brain. There's less density, neural density in that part of the brain. And when you do functional MRI to see how active it is, there's less activity. And then third, you have the hippocampus. It plays a big role in memory and mood. And hippocampal volumes are actually smaller in kids who've had that early adversity. So this is all great, but people don't come into my clinic and say, hi, we're here today because we're concerned that our child's hippocampal volumes are too small. Hasn't happened. Instead, what they do is they come in and they say, we're here because we're concerned because school's noticed, we've noticed, whoever, child is impulsive. They can't plan ahead. They're anxious. They can't delay gratification. Their mood's all over the place. Their memory's crummy. Okay, so what does this sound a lot like? So I was like, yeah, what we might term ADHD, and often do term ADHD. I have a lot of patients when I work in the community health center with this diagnosis of ADHD, okay? And many of them are on medication. Now, here's the thing. Some of them have what I call classical ADHD. They've got good support, parents are trying, they're trying, school's trying, everyone's trying, and they just cannot pay attention. Those kids, yeah, it's probably good old ADHD, and actually they tend to do really well with a relatively small dose of medication. And their attention comes up, their classroom performance improves, their grades come up, their self-esteem goes up. Yay, everyone's happy. Okay, that is like 5 of the patients I have. Not 5%, 5, okay? So what about all these other kids that have this ADHD label and are on medication? Well, I've learned that when I do assessments, I start at the beginning. I say to the parent, when you were pregnant with this child, start there and tell me everything that happened and walk me forward to the present day. And yeah, birth weight and hospitalizations and surgeries and all that stuff. Yeah, I want to know all that. That's important. But I also ask, point blank, but kindly and gently, and explaining why I need to know. Did you always have enough to eat in your home? Were you ever homeless? Did your child ever witness violence? Was your child ever the subject of violence? And what do I hear? Yes, 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 and yes. And what I start to recognize is that by the time I'm seeing this kid at 6, 8, 13, 15, whatever it is, that the pileup of things that happened in just the first few years of life was quite significant. And I ask myself, is what I'm really seeing here ADHD? Or am I seeing the brain changes that are associated with adversity? And the answer is very clear to me. It's the brain changes associated with adversity. Okay? So the thing is, there's no magic medication to make that go away. We may still keep them on medication to help with the symptoms, but that's like giving Tylenol for meningitis, right? Tylenol will bring the fever down associated with meningitis. It does not fix the raging infection around the brain and spinal cord, right? For that you need antibiotics and other interventions and so on. So, yes, we might short-term do something to help with symptoms, but we also need to do more, which generally consists of long, intensive therapy from people who know what they're doing and that are covered by insurance. So that's a lot of ifs, right? Must be covered by insurance, must be well-trained in trauma and its role. And number 3 is family has to be able to actually take advantage of the therapy, right? Many families I worked with, you say, oh, come in for 45 minutes twice a week for this intensive therapy. It'll be going on for 12 weeks. We'll see how long he needs it. And they're looking at me going, I nearly got fired from my job just to come here today once. I can't come twice a week. I'll lose my job, we'll lose our home, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to recognize that for many families, that, you know, this is why prevention is so important. Okay. How many of you have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Okay. Fair number of you. And when I talk to medical audiences, that number is also going up, but still many people have not heard of it, which is why I call it the most important study that many have probably never heard of. This is a study, as a reminder, looking at adults. It looked at 17,000 adults and asked them what happened to you as a child, and then tried to link it to what their long-term outcomes were. Really well done. I want to point out something really important because people often say, oh yeah, the ACEs study, I know all about that. That's what happens to people living in poverty. Nope, the people in it were middle-class folks, mostly college-educated, mostly Caucasian, in their 50s at this point. Okay, so this is not an impoverished at-risk population. This is actually very much a study of the middle class. They looked at these different categories of abuse and neglect and household dysfunction. And the numbers appearing on the right are the prevalence of these things in that population. These are sky-high numbers. No one expected to find these. The highest one up there, 26%. Physical abuse. They didn't expect to hear that much. Even the lowest number up there, 1 in 20. Okay, that's a lot of people this is affecting. Now, you can't really measure intensity of trauma, right? You can't say your trauma was twice as bad as this person's trauma or whatever. But you can give them a point, so to speak, for each category they say yes to. And that's how they came up with what we call an ACE score. And again, a quarter said they had only 1. But 4 or 5 or 6, again, it was 1 in 20 for each of those. And then they found the effects were cumulative and sometimes extraordinarily long-term. So look at this graph. This shows you your risk of having developmental delay in the first 3 years of life. If you had 5, 6, or 7 adverse childhood experiences, you had 75 to almost 100% chance of having developmental delay. Right? We know that developmental delay takes, you got to screen for it, identify it, refer, evaluation, therapy. I mean, it takes a lot of work and effort to do those things. So quite significant versus a much lower number if you had just 1 or 2. This next slide blew my mind when I first saw it. This is your risk for adult heart disease based on your childhood adversity. Adult heart disease, right? 3 times the odds if you had 7 or 8 adverse childhood experiences. So really quite significant. And I could show you 40 more slides of all the connections that they found. The ACEs study is not a fluke. It's been repeated over and over again. Wisconsin has its own ACEs study that they've been doing for several years. We're seeing about the same numbers each time it's being done. But the last point from that report was that if we get it right early on, it's more effective and less costly than trying to figure it out later. So, if you think about a child's developmental progress over time, you got the kids who we consider quote-unquote healthy. We want them to stay on that trajectory. Then we see the kids who we know are higher risk, right? They have a nice label you can put on them, like the X 26-week preemie, right? You know they're at risk for developmental delay, and you'll label them as such, as needing more. And then you get the kids who are at risk, right? There's a lot more of them. They're not as easily labeled sometimes, and so on. Here's the thing. All of these curves get pushed downward by adversity. It's not that you're magically shielded if you started off healthy. If you're still young, you're still vulnerable. So we need good protective interventions to be able to shield them from the effects of that adversity. So what are those things? Well, for the healthy kids, it's things we should already be doing. Good anticipatory guidance, reading together, proper appropriate discipline, health services, preschool, all those things will help keep that curve pushed up there. For the at-risk kids, you can do additional things like parental responsiveness training. Right? The parent who doesn't know how to do that back and forth interaction, we can model that, we can coach that, we can do all that. Good language stimulation. They need to hear words from people, not products. Okay? They need to hear people interacting with them. And then good high-quality early childhood education. And then for the youngest kids, home visiting, specialized services, et cetera, is all those things will make a difference in pushing things forward. Okay, so some numbers to remember about the early brain. There are 700 new neural connections happening per second in that developing brain. We want them to happen well. Why? Because of notions like this thing we call brain plasticity. There's two types, synaptic and cellular. Don't worry about what they mean. The key is in this third line here. Synaptic plasticity is lifelong. We are all using this to learn. But cellular plasticity is already declining by age 5. Yes, those kindergartners are over the hill in at least one way. Right? So this means that if we wait to do intervention until later, it's harder because we don't have that second type of brain plasticity to call on. This is why we don't wait to fix speech delay until age 8, because it's a lot easier at age 3 than it is at 8. It's a lot easier at 18 months than it is at 3. Again, you can always do it and make some progress. It's just a lot harder to do so. We see disparities in vocabulary by 18 months of age. This graph shows you the child's receptive vocabulary, their ability to understand language. The richest kids are already pulling away from their less affluent peers by 18 months, the middle class kids by 24 months. Okay, so the achievement gap that we talk about so much in our society is not middle school getting it wrong, or elementary school, or even preschool. Preschool is like out here, right? If we can measure it in toddlerhood, you know these things are starting in infancy. So we'll fix the achievement gap when we do serious and substantial investment in the first 1,000 days of life and then support those gains. Because for every dollar we put into early childhood, we see $4 to $9 in return. Who says that? People like James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics at the University of Chicago. He's made this his life's work. He says it's not that you have zero rate of return on job training, schooling, preschool, but the highest rate of return is early on. And long before we had MRIs and all that stuff, Frederick Douglass told us it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Okay, so now that I've depressed everyone, what can we do about all this, right? How can we actually make a difference? Well, I'll give you the solution. Not really. I'll give you principles of solutions, okay? Because there's a lot of different ways to approach this and a lot of different factors. So we need solutions that do a number of things. We need to build capabilities, right? How do we build the capability in the parent to do effective interaction with their young child and so on? If they don't know how to do that, fine. We can model, coach, all that stuff. We need to build capacity. Parent says, I know how to do that, but I can't do it because I'm working my second job that keeps me out of the house in the evenings, et cetera, et cetera. Fine, what can we do to lift some of those burdens from that parent so they can do the good job of parenting that they know how to do and want to do and just need a little more slack to be able to do it. Do things that are based in homes and communities. Don't make them trek across town to some special center or place or whatever. Address root causes wherever possible. Have a good long-term effects. Use a prevention mindset. leverage those key first 1,000 days of life. Use things that are evidence-guided. You notice I don't say evidence-based. Sometimes funders are always asking for things that are evidence-based. If you only do evidence-based stuff, you will do the same 12 things over and over and over because you will not be able to grow your evidence base further. Okay? So, you need to push back a little sometimes with funders and just remind them that they're actually limiting the universe of possibilities when they insist on things that are only in the peer-reviewed published literature, right? They should be willing to take a chance on some things because that will help us grow the base of evidence out there as well. We also shouldn't do things that are utterly foolish, of course, right? But use evidence to guide you, not necessarily to be the sole determinant of what should be done. And then finally, we need things that are scalable, okay? Because we have a lot of things that work really well if you're willing to spend $10,000 per child, for 6 months. Okay, great, yeah, you can do all sorts of wonderful things, but that's not something that we can take to scale for the huge amount of need that exists out there. Okay, so let's talk for a little bit about reading. That graph I showed you with the 18 months disparity stuff comes from what's known as the Hart-Risley study, which really looked at things that were happening in American homes and tried to look at differences in interaction, in connection, and language production, things like that. Another thing that came out of that study was this fact that you may have heard about this 30 million word gap, okay? That children in lower-income families are hearing 30 million fewer words than their more affluent peers by age 4. Now, I want to be really clear about something here. It's not just about the number of words. If it was purely about having the number of words, we would tell parents to bark words at their children, and it doesn't matter what they are, right? No. And I don't want anyone to start doing the verbal Fitbit, right, where it measures how many words you say to your kid, and that's it. Because it's a proxy. It's a proxy for interaction. And we all know that some Fitbit owners, in order to reach their goal, are busy tying it to their dog's collar and letting them go chase squirrels. No. And so on. So we want to make sure that that's getting handled and handled well. Because about a third of children are being flagged on kindergarten screening assessments as having some issue, some concern. This is a national figure. And a lot don't catch up well. One study showed that if you were behind in first grade, 88% of those same kids were still behind in fourth grade. Okay, so it's not like there's a magic leveling effect as hard as school tries to make up that difference. So when a child doesn't read well, it leads to this whole cascade of school issues, and this vicious cycle just kind of feeds on itself. And something else happens after a certain point that sometimes you find an issue that's been getting in the way of being able to perform effectively in school. It's rare, but every so often you discover, hey, this kid can't see, right? Their vision's terrible. Or, wow, this kid can't hear well. And somehow it never got picked up or whatever. I actually had this happen in clinic not so long ago. A family that had moved around a lot, and she kind of fell through the cracks, and brought in their 8-year-old and said, teacher's concerned. They said she doesn't pay attention really well. They hadn't said to me they're wondering if she needs to be on medicine, but it was sort of implied. And I'm looking at the kid, and this family is emigrated from Mexico when this child was young, and they'd moved around between a lot of cities. And I said, has she ever had hearing problems? And they said, oh, well, when she was a baby, they said there was some hearing problem. They weren't clear on the details, but they said there was nothing that could be done. I said, yeah, because I'm watching her before I even look at her. I'm watching her. She's lip reading. She's taught herself to lip read. And she doesn't need Ritalin. She needs an audiologist and an ENT visit, right? So we sent her off for all that to get evaluated, right? That looks like inattention, right? So great, we can fix that. But how many years has this kid been told, or told herself, that she's not good at school? That she just doesn't understand, or whatnot, right? So you get this issue of self-esteem getting damaged. It's really hard to turn that around, as well. So this is, again, another good reason to kind of catch this stuff early and make sure that we are able to catch this before it turns into this bigger problem about self-esteem. So, as my colleague Perry Klass says, when I think about children that don't have books, she thinks about it almost like when you hear about hungry children or homeless children, right? That this is, and it deprives them before they've had a fair chance. And that we really need to make sure we make a big difference there. So, having said all this, why reading? Right? Because there's so many different skills out there. Why focus so much on reading, per se? And here's why. Because reading in our society is the fundamental skill we have for learning. Okay? This is the most efficient way we have of transferring information from one human being to another. Until we create the way that you can just put a little port in the side of your head and just plug in, there's no other way to create transfer of information efficiently in as much volume, when you can read and read well. So the total universe of possibilities, career, etc., open to children who don't read or can't read or don't read well is shrinking as our society moves on. It wasn't that long ago that you could say, little Johnny doesn't read well, but you know what? He's really good with understanding mechanical things. He understands spatial stuff and how things fit together and whatever. He may make a really good automobile mechanic, right? He may be able to really understand intuitively how to work on these things. Right? Well, look at cars today, right? You bring it to the service center and they're plugging it into computers, and there's huge manuals, and so much is software driven now, right? So the number of meaningful career options available for people who can't read well has shrunk. So we need to make sure that reading happens and happens well. So when a young child is aware of books, there's a few things that come along with that. The first thing is this idea that printed words actually are trying to convey meaning. Okay? And this is central to this notion of what we call emergent literacy, that print conveys information. We've forgotten this. Even an illiterate adult knows that print conveys information. They just can't read it. But the average 2-year-old, even who's been read to, doesn't recognize that when you read aloud from a picture book like this one, that the little black marks on the bottom of the page are telling you what to say. They think you're telling the story just by looking at the pictures. Wow, and you use the exact same words each time. Isn't that interesting? Right? So I remember when the 3-year-old starts to get it. They may not know any letters, but they're looking and saying, wait a minute, there's something going on here. I remember when my son was 3 and my daughter was 2, I had them both up in my lap. I was reading a book like this one. I was reading the words on this side of the page, and my thumb was over the words on this side. And my daughter was just listening away. And I remember my son reaching down and shoving my thumb out of the way. He was looking at these little black marks and saying, there's something going on here. There's some connection between these and what I'm saying. And one of the reasons I think that Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are is one of the finest pieces of picture books out there. Does anyone remember what's on the last page of that book? Yeah, the last few pages are, and Max sailed into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him, and it was still hot. There's no picture there. It's just those words. So when a kid hears you read those pages in the same way, all through the pages, the last one, and there's no picture there to guide you, but just those little black marks, it kind of takes them and it shoves them in that direction of saying, hey, there's something going on here. Right? So wonderful little masterstroke there. Second thing that comes along with literacy is using background knowledge and strategies to obtain meaning from print. We use this throughout our entire lives. In the Great Green Room, there was a picture of a cow jumping over the moon. Yes, okay, good. Don't want to do remedial goodnight moon here. So you know the answer moon because you've read this book 82,000 times to a young child. Or you know the nursery rhyme in our society about, the cow jumping over the moon. Or you look at the picture in the upper left there and you say, oh, cow jumping, that looks like the moon. The answer must be moon, right? These are all ways to get to that correct answer of moon. In Where the Wild Things Are, the wild things roar their terrible roars and show their terrible claws and roll their terrible eyes and do what with their terrible teeth? Gnashed, yeah, they gnash their terrible teeth. Now, I don't use the word gnashed in everyday conversation, okay? But a child who hears that says, I don't know what gnashed means, but the other things are scary things that the wild things are doing. Gnashing must be something scary with the teeth. Okay, that's a pretty good working definition, right? It works, and the kid can just accept that and move along because they've learned to extrapolate from context. And then the more you look at words and all, you become a fluent reader. You're able to look at words and say, books, and you know what that means, instead of going, whoa, oh, books, and all that. The other concept is this idea of something called dialogic reading, and I don't usually say these words to parents in the clinic because it sounds kind of technical and all, but it's this idea that there's different ways to read to young kids that fits their developmental style. So this happens to me, a fair amount. Somebody brings their 15-month-old child in, and I give them the child a book, and I say, tell me, how often do you get a chance to share books together? And they say to me, oh, he used to like being read to, but he doesn't like it anymore. So, well, that's interesting. You know what, could you just read a few pages out loud to him of that book I just gave you? They say, okay, sure. And they sit their 15-month-old down, and they open the book, and they say, that very night, the next grew, the forest grew, and grew until, okay, what's this 15-month-old doing already? Wandering off, probably, right? Because the 15-month-old has an attention span of half a second, and that is normal, right? This is a normal thing. But the parent looks at me helplessly and says, see, he doesn't like it, he's going on. See, well, he likes it just fine, he's still listening, and he'd be great, but you know what? Let me have you just give him the book, pull him up in your lap, let him hold the book, let him manipulate the book, let him go backwards in the book, let him pick out random pages, turn it into a game. Can you find Max in this book? Where's Max? Oh, there he is. What's he doing? He's in a boat, yes. What color is his boat? Yes, that's a red boat, right? You turn it into this dialogue, this conversation. I don't care if you never, ever read the story. I'm not going to make you write an essay on it, okay? So, because often parents are thinking, reading aloud is what we did in grade school, where you read exactly what it says on the page and everyone else sits quietly and listens. And when they see their kid not doing that at a much younger than grade school age, they think, oh no, he doesn't like it. Oh, I don't like reading either. He's going to be just like me, isn't he? Right? And you see that cycle, So giving them permission to read in a different way and to do this back and forth is important, because it may not be a natural skill, right? If you've not seen kids being read to in that way, and if you don't realize what's happening, how would you know how to do it? We also need to make sure the parent themselves is capable of reading, right? And refer them on if they have trouble, and realize it can be a multi-generational issue. Because reading is using a lot of different parts of the brain, a lot of circuits, a lot of skills. We are not hardwired for reading. We are hardwired for speech, but not for reading. It uses a lot of brain power. And this is why, like, kids who have concussion, and we need to have them do brain rest. That's one of the few times I'll tell a kid not to read, and to give themselves some time. But when it works and it works well, reading shows us how much potential has really come out and come up so nicely. And as, again, Dr. Klaus says, reading is a triumph of the early brain. The main message here, though, is that we want reading to be fun and enjoyable. Okay, we are not trying to teach anyone to read early. I'm not impressed by the 2-year-old who's dragging in a copy of Harry Potter or whatever. Okay, I just want reading to be fun and enjoyable, so when they show up in school and the teacher pulls out a book to read out loud, the kid's going, oh, a book, and not going, what is that? So I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about Reach Out and Read, which is a program that started at Boston City Hospital 29 years ago. It started down the hall in a primary care clinic from where I was coding these face-to-face videotapes. So it's now in 6,000 clinics throughout the country, and is rapidly becoming a part of the pediatric care that's provided. If I had to sum it up in one graphic, it would be this item here, what I call the prescription to read. I actually do hand these out in clinic. I also handed them out at our state capitol or capitol in DC when I've done advocacy for Reach Out and Read. Because of what I've told you today, this may be the most important prescription I ever hand a family. Okay, because of what it sets into motion. Because yes, this is health. When people ask me, what's the most important thing for lifelong health? And they think I'm going to say diet or exercise or whatever. Actually, I think it's education. I think it's clearly education, because when you have a good education, you're successful, it opens up career options, and that opens up the ability to access resources that let you do those other things well, and so on. So what do we do in Regenerate? The clinician, we do a training with clinicians, so the physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, who's doing the actual checkup, the regular checkup, starting basically at birth and going up to 5 years of age. We walk in with a book in our hand into the exam room. Not the front desk, not anyone else, in our hand. I give it directly to the child because I want to see what they do with it. If they are 18 months or older, I give them the book upside down on purpose. Why? They can't read yet, but they recognize something doesn't look right about this, right? And I look to see, can they at least start to try to turn it around? The 5-year-old who I walk in and they say, oh, forgive me, this book, yeah, I love this book. And they jump off the table, run over to me, grab the book and start turning pages. Okay, I heard language, vision, gross motor skills, ran over, fine motor skills, they're turning pages, right? They did all this stuff. I did most of my developmental surveillance and it took me 6 seconds. Great, wonderful. I don't have a lot of time in that room. I need to be efficient, right? Very different from the 4-year-old, true story, who was actually the sibling of the 6-month-old I was seeing, first time I met this family. And I gave him a spare book we had, and he walked, I was watching him out of the corner of my eye the whole visit. He sat there with the book upside down, backwards, and closed the whole visit. He didn't have the intellectual curiosity to open it. And when I mentioned it to Mom at the end, in a kind, gentle, but supportive fashion, I said, I noticed he didn't open this, and I'm a little concerned. How often do you get a chance to read? And she just looked at him and she said, see, even the doctor's telling you to read, right? She knew it was important. She had gotten that message, but what was she doing? She was kind of putting the book there and going, okay, kid, go read. Go look at the book, right? Not recognizing that good shared reading is what has to happen. The parent is just as important. Right? They need to structure, nurture that connection, that relationship. They need to be there. It's not just, here, kid, look at this book. They're not going to learn that on their own. This is why I actually am not a huge fan of most book giveaway programs in isolation. I think programs that get books to children are lovely, but if the family and the child don't know what to do with the book, it doesn't matter. We need to have there be good modeling and coaching, and then those books become more valuable. Merely mailing a book to someone's house in and of itself, this gets a book into the house, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to get used and used well. So we need to make sure we do all those things. I want to play a video for you just to show you an example of what an interaction looks like, and you can hear some of the advice and so on. This is not scripted because you cannot get a 12-month-old to follow a script. So.
How are you guys? You're okay. You say okay. My memory was good. All in all, is to me this important for kids to love to me. Is that, what do you see? Do you agree? Yes. Yeah. Well, we just love that the kids get those early, the book that you love to read with her. I don't know every time today that you might spend with her reading a book or on weekends.
It's really on weekends.
And she's also a great master.
She is
So that, when she was little, she would put everything in her mouth. And I remember we were talking about that. Now that she's older, she probably won't do it that often. She'll do it a little bit less. But every once in a while, she's still exploring using her mouth and all of her new teeth. And she's still in her testing. She might see that she feels so much better using her fingers to open the book. And she'll also be asking you to read the book. And before she might just look at it, if she likes the book that you have, or she's interested in something in it, like a cat or an animal that she sees, she might get your attention with the book. But she's just really doing great at loving that book.
It's cool. I don't read to the girls as much as learning. I know she does. She says, I'm going to just go so bad. She knows the girls pick up. Sometimes I see in the bed with the stories. This is definitely
Well, we love that because they're learning from you how wonderful it is to be together, to be together as a family, or even just you and Nala, and reading the books together is a really nice
But being home to bed, smelling red, like strawberry.
No, she was like this. So she's exploring it more. She's doing what I expect a 1-year-old to do.
Okay, so there was so much in there that we could pull out, just watching that interaction, listening to it, and so on. This child is, people are talking around her, right? I mean, just listen to her babbling, right? You know she's imitating the talking. They're singing around her. You could hear her singing throughout that. Her face lit up when that book got held out to her. She was exploring it. She was still doing some outing, which is normal at her age, but not, tons of that. We learned a lot about the family. Who's at home? Dad, mom, grandma's around, siblings. Dad's works a lot, but when he is home, what do? They get all pile into bed together. They're looking at books together, right? They enjoy being around each other. There's good, strong relationships here among family members. When he started reading, she did that lovely moment of looking up at him to kind of check in, and then back down for that moment of what we call joint attention, looking at an object together. Dad did dialogic reading, right? You see the mouse? That's the mouse. That's not in the text. He's actually calling it out there. She had a short attention span. Dad kind of got a little nervous. Yes, we're looming with cameras there, but you got a little, discouraged there, and, the doctor jumped in and said, no, that's absolutely fine, and so on. There is so much that came out of that. So many elements, so many pieces you could pick out. And the most incredible thing is, if you time that movie, it's only 3 minutes. It's only 3 minutes. So it's a very good use of time. So I'd like to think of programs like Reach Out and Read as being like the story of the blind man feeling the elephant and all feeling different aspects of it. That programs like Reach Out and Read are like that elephant. People say, oh, you're giving away books in the clinic. Yes, but you know what? Actually, we're doing so much more than that. We're trying to do an educational intervention of sorts. We're using this as a way to do developmental surveillance. We're trying to build parental capacities. We're trying to buffer toxic stress. That having your child up against you, kind of nestled in, etc. We're trying to assess relationships, as well. Public health, and it's a scalable, actually evidence-based model. So it's not any one of these things, of course. When it comes down to it, it's actually all of these things. And those are the types of solutions that we need, or things that do different types of work effectively and efficiently and inexpensively. And if you want to read more about these different pieces and how we kind of get at that, a colleague and I actually wrote a piece called, yes, The Elephant in the Clinic. That URL is actually outdated. I need to pull that off the slide. But if you just go to Google and type The Elephant in the Clinic, it'll pop right up. It's a free download, not a very long PDF. It's designed to be read by anyone. It's not a overly technical piece, and so on. So feel free to enjoy that. So, what do I tell parents? I tell them, please read together daily. Read aloud. Give your child a bedside lamp at a relatively young age, and just give them a couple of minutes even before you turn on lights to just look at books on their own. Okay, set up that habit. Limit screen time. I need to update this. It's actually less than an hour a day, no screen time for a kid under 2. I have a whole talk on digital media, so I won't dwell on the details of that too much, but screens do interfere with a lot of aspects of development, particularly in young children. No screens in bedrooms. No good comes of this. Causes all sorts of issues. Audiobooks are fine. Visit your school and public libraries. And again, have reading be fun and not a chore. There's too many things in life that we worry about, milestones and measurements and all those sorts of things. I don't want this to also be one of those things where we can help it. I will say, and then for Wisconsin, how are we doing with Reach Out and Read? The first program was in 1997 in La Crosse. And all these people heard about the program and worked with National Center in Boston to get it set up. About 30 programs popped up, plateaued for a while. I got a few more going in Madison, which when I moved there in 2006 actually had one program. It was actually quite stunning that it hadn't happened. We got Reach Out and Read Wisconsin founded, which is our state affiliate for Reach Out and Read to do more technical assistance and so on. And this graph I can't even keep up to date. We're now at 220 plus programs as of last week. And to show you visually, this is how we look when we started Reach Out and Read Wisconsin. Red is the counties that had at least one Reach Out and Read program. About 50 had popped up over time. And again, I can't even keep this map up to date here. We're now at 220 something, and so on. Anyone here from Douglas County locally here? Yeah, a few hands. So I'm just going to point out that, it's kind of an embarrassing gray box up there in the upper left. Just saying, Okay. So get your pediatricians and family docs on board. We'd love to have you join the Reach Out and Read fold. So, okay. So to wrap this up, I wanted to say a few things in closing conceptually to think about brain development. We need to think about, with all the programs and projects and advice that we give, we need to think about kind of this multi-step approach. We got kids that are going to fall, so we need nets to catch them. So the first net, our big net, is what everyone gets, right? This is your prevention net. It's a big net, but it has some big holes, okay? But ideally, it catches a lot of kids. So for the ones who fall through, you bring out your second net. It's a smaller net, but it has smaller holes. This is your screening, your targeted interventions, and the sorts of things you can do for folks that you identify as having certain particular needs. There's still holes in that, and there's hopefully a very small number of kids falling through, and that's when you call out your treatment net. If you let everything fall down as far as the treatment net, that net gets overwhelmed and the kids fall off into the abyss, so to speak. All levels of this are necessary. None on their own are sufficient. Okay, you can't do without all three levels. But we need to make sure we invest well in those levels. We can think about things like the 5 hours of early childhood education. This comes from the AAP's School Readiness Technical Report. Kids need routines. They need to know what we expect of them and what they expect of us. They need daily reading. They need rhyming, which means playing, cuddling, interaction. It doesn't really work. They were looking for an R. Just go with it. Okay. Rewards, because some kids don't hear praise. And again, relationships, because that's so important, as I've shown you. So I started by reading to you from The Dot. And the reason I chose The Dot was because it's a story about a relationship. It's a story about a relationship between a teacher and a child. It's a story about how she supported that child even on a day when she was not feeling so great and kind of felt she couldn't do anything and so on. Celebrated her successes and let her kind of build out what her own talent brought her. But there's another thing that happened in that book. We don't know if it was intentional skill building because we're not inside that teacher's head. But that teacher did some skill building because what did Vashti do at the end? She turned around and she mentored another kid using the same method, right? So it kind of shows you how you can demonstrate, model, and coach these things in a gentle way and actually build these skills in others. Wisconsin has made some progress in terms of thinking about how we handle these things. A few years ago in 2013, a joint Senate resolution was passed unanimously through the Senate and the Assembly. And what they said was, this is just a resolved clause, that policy decisions enacted by the legislature will acknowledge and take into account early childhood brain development, will consider toxic stress, early adversity, buffering relationships, early intervention and investment, to achieve a lasting foundation for a more prosperous and sustainable state through investing in human capital. I might have written 2/3 of this. This is a resolution. There's no money tied to it. There's no force of law. But you know what? You got to think several moves ahead. And if you read the whole thing, we kept the name of programs out of it. We didn't want this to be an ad for a program. So anyone who works with children can take this resolution and go talk to their elected officials at any level and say, hey, look, our state said this. First state legislature in the country to say this, by the way. Several others have now copied us since. And say, hey, we do X, or we want to propose Y. It builds right off of this. So we meant this as a gift to the early childhood world, and which is why we put the success kit up there with the fist pump and the hashtag winning, and so on. All right. I want to close with a quote from the Sutton Trust that's based in the United Kingdom, but I think this holds true for the U.S. even more so. While schools can do much to raise achievement among children who initially lag behind their peers, all too often preschool gaps set and train a pattern of ever-increasing inequality during school years and beyond. Any drive to improve social mobility must begin with an effective strategy to nurture the fledgling talent in young children so often lost before it has had a chance to flourish. Because I think we see too much of that, and we need to make sure we support those things well. And I always end with this. This is my wife. I caught her in this beautiful moment years ago, lost in a book reading to my son. It reminds me that children are made readers in the laps of their parents, and that parents are their child's first and best teachers. And we need to make sure that parents see themselves that way, value themselves that way, and then we give them the strategies to make sure that they're able to be successful in that role over time. My email address and my public-facing social media, if you wish to follow along with the things I post, please do so. And then, so I'm out of time here. I will be around for the good chunk of the day, so if you have questions, I'm happy to have you come up and ask individually, or contact me later through social media or email or anything like that. Thank you again for the work that you do and for your attention today. Thank you.